We talk so much about offshore banking here at Nomad Capitalist that a lot of folks who live in the United States don't understand that their US bank plays an important role in their international plan. I'll tell you why and what to do in this video. Hi, I'm Andrew Henderson, and as you may know, the United States has a unique tax policy for folks who want to go offshore and who want to invest offshore. But with all the challenges and the extra work that come with doing that as a US citizen, actually comes a rather unique advantage. Whether you want to stay in the United States and simply invest overseas, or whether you want to leave the United States and participate in a lot of the legal tax reduction strategies we talk about, you can actually keep a US bank account as part of your mix. In fact, I often encourage it. But there are certain types of US banks that you're going to want to work with because from an operational level, if you are used to living in the United States, you might want to keep your US credit cards, keep that Amex Platinum or that Chase Reserve card. And so most people who move overseas, they're not going to find a comparable credit card product, and there are just other reasons operationally why they want to keep that US account to pay some bills in the US, whether it's for their house they're keeping, whether it's the credit cards, whatever it may be. And so if you're a US person, keeping a US bank account, even if it's just $5,000 in there, is just a good thing to do. Now, the bank that you work with is important because if you've only lived and moved money around the United States before, then your bank knows you as they know the rest of their customers. As a domestic customer, there's low risk in that, and you probably haven't had any problems. Once you start to go overseas, that's when you start to expose which banks are good and which banks are bad for the global citizen, the nomad capitalist lifestyle. And so what I would say is you probably want to avoid most of the bigger banks as well as most of the really small banks. Chase has been one of the worst offenders. I personally had a problem with Chase. I've had other people who've told me they've had a problem with Chase. In my case, it was logging in too many times overseas. I was in Romania and I logged in and I tried to send money from my Chase account to a foreign account. I had built up more money than I wanted in that account and I wanted to send it to my foreign account, I think in Singapore. So nothing too sketchy, nothing too concerning. And I remember getting some weird phone call from someone who didn't even identify themselves. And I'm just like, yeah, no thanks. And then the next thing I know, my account was frozen. You need to step into a branch. Since there are no Chase branches in Romania, and since I did not want to return to the United States, I left the account frozen from online access. The account was still usable. I could still receive money. I could still, do whatever. But I couldn't log into the account. That also meant my Chase credit cards, I eventually just gave up and closed them because I got tired of calling customer service every month and saying, read me my charges. Tell me, let me make sure there's nothing on there. I was literally frozen out. And it was because I was logging in too much from overseas. You might think that a VPN is the solution to that, but a lot of banks have gotten pretty savvy and they know what's a VPN and they know who's really in the United States or in the country. So Chase was an issue. The big banks that have worked for a lot of folks have been like Bank of America, Wells Fargo. Those have been actually surprisingly good. The one thing, if you're going to work with those big banks, is they're pretty big on text verification. So you'll want to get some kind of phone number or some kind of text solution to be able to receive two-factor codes when you go to log in. But those have been decent. Other banks, big banks, are oftentimes just so big that they don't want to deal with anybody who's different. They deal with the same kind of person. It's like the cattle call. Everyone's the same. Everyone follows the same risk profile. If you start to travel too much, we're going to freak out. The same happens on the really small banks. Now, obviously, there are thousands of banks and credit unions in the US. I can't speak to them all. Feel free to leave a comment below with your banking experiences abroad. I'd like to hear you and your opinion. But generally what we've seen in our experience in helping people is that credit unions have somewhat of the same issue where you log in too much and they freak out, or they just don't know how to deal with any kind of international transactions. They don't want to deal with that. Again, it's this kind of the same issue, but for different reasons. The big banks, it's like an operational issue. They don't really train their people very well. It's a constant revolving door of staff at some of the larger banks. You can't really get a good relationship unless you have like a Chase private client or Chase private wealth where you have a lot of money and you have one person. If you're just in the mass market banking, they don't really have time to get to know you. The smaller banks, in the US are the same as smaller banks in a lot of countries. They just freak out because they don't want risk. They're risk averse. And so what you want is kind of a mid-market, mid-size bank. If you can find one that has some international exposure, that would be good. I personally have a bank that has specifically asked me not to talk about them because they're somewhat invitation only. But my bank in the US has somewhat of an international focus. They're big enough to where they're not freaking out over every little thing. I have a relationship with them where I can tell them, hey, here's what I'm going to do. I call my banker and I say, hey, I want to send some money here or there. And they understand what I do. Okay. So what you want is a bank that's big enough to not be freaked out by going overseas as if you're like, falling into a pit of dragons at the end of the flat earth. You don't want that, but you want a bank that's not so huge that you can actually get to know someone. A mid-sized bank is good. One bank that I haven't personally worked with, but I've heard one or two good comments about is Bank of China in New York. They had a deal a while back in May still where you can actually hold renminbi in the United States. But again, pretty big bank in China, not a huge bank in the United States. You may be able to get the personalized attention. The key that you want is you want to be able to have a relationship with your banker, because what's going to happen is banks like to know, they like continuity. They like the same things happening again and again. This is why you don't want just random spikes and random transactions and random foreign payments. I'm not saying that if you send money overseas from a US account, you're going to be immediately flagged and have a huge problem. What I'm saying is if you can prevent potential problems by having someone that you know and you can explain to them, hey, I'm going to be traveling. Hey, most of my ATM card usage is going to be overseas. That's fine. I'll tell you, my parents came to visit me once in Malaysia a couple years ago and recently, and their bank, one of the larger banks, said, we're not letting you use your ATM card in Malaysia because it's a high fraud country. That's absolutely insane. But again, the large banks, they just, they don't really care. They don't have any customers barely that are going to Malaysia. So they just make these sweeping statements that just have no basis in reality. The mid-sized banks would solve that. Here's the next piece of the equation. A lot of people are dealing with online banks, banks on an app. People talk a lot about Schwab. I've personally had a bad experience with Schwab. I know others like it. The main thing with Schwab is there's no ATM fees. My bank has the same thing. If you shop around, you can probably find a bank with no ATM fees. And by the way, to me, $5 to solve an operational issue is not really the biggest thing I'm going for. Schwab has really started to crack down, from what I've seen in my experience, on people who are overseas. They want, and this is just my opinion, they want people who travel overseas and who take advantage of the account to travel, but they seem to becoming less and less enamored with the permanent traveler or the expat, where they want you to be in the US every once in a while. Again, I don't have any firm documentation, but from what I've seen, I believe that is the trend. And that matches the trend I've seen with other online-only banks. You see, as I talk about whether it's in the US or whether it's offshore, when you have a better relationship, like in person with a bank, they're going to be a bit more flexible with you because they know you and they've given you the stamp of approval. If you open a bank account online where you've never seen another human, if you start doing stuff that's out of their parameters, they're going to lower the boom on you pretty quickly. I had an account with Ally a number of years ago. I had like the FDIC maximum in the account, and they literally just emailed me one day saying, yeah, we see you're overseas a lot, and you're logging in, and I don't know, we don't know what's going on, so we've closed your account. We mailed you a check. They mailed the check to an address that I hadn't lived at for a while, and so I had to call them and straighten that out. And to their credit, they straightened it out. But these online banks, not only are they more difficult to open, like they're not open to non-residents, they're not open to non-citizens the way like a Bank of America would be, but they're also, I believe the trend is that they're less open to people who are international in nature. Again, they just want people who fall into the basic net. They have a salary, they have a 9-to-5, they move some money every month into their Ally account or whatever, and that's it. It's just easy. That's what the big banks want. That's what the online banks want. Capital One actually may be the one exception where they're a bit better, but this is what you need to do. Having a US bank is a great thing to keep in your mix. I strongly recommend it. A lot of people like it, and they can keep some of their semblance of life in the United States, keep their bills paid there, and it's just a safety net for a lot of people to know that you don't have to give up that US bank account. but I do want you to make sure that you have one that works with your global citizen lifestyle. And those are the tips that I would follow to make sure that you don't get yourself in a bind when you're overseas. Hi, I'm Andrew Henderson from Nomad Capitalist. I wrote this book, which you can find on Amazon, to distill a lot of the stuff we talk about in these videos and a lot of the stuff I've learned over the last decade plus traveling all around the world, teaching you about how to legally reduce your taxes, build your personal freedom, and create wealth faster. Definitely get a copy of this book if you want to learn more. Now, if you want to watch more videos, make sure you subscribe to our channel and make sure you click the notifications bell so you never miss one of our new videos with more tips on how to go where you're treated best. And if you're already a 6- or 7-figure entrepreneur and you'd like to put these strategies in place for yourself, go to nomadcapitalist.com and learn about how I can help.